Scalpel.
Here, clamp the vessel.
Clamping.
Good, suction.
Suction ready.
The surgeon's glove hit the floor with a sound that shouldn't have carried across an entire operating theater, but somehow it did. Dr. Marcus Reeves stood at the head of the table, his silver hair perfect under the surgical lights, his reputation worth more than most people's houses. He was looking at the scrub nurse who just handed him the wrong instrument for the third time that morning, a young woman whose name tag read Emma Cole, and whose first day was rapidly becoming her last. "You're useless," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of surgical precision that could cut deeper than any scalpel. "Completely useless. I wouldn't trust you to organize my sock drawer, let alone assist in my OR." The observation gallery above held 20 medical students, their notebooks forgotten, their phones now recording. This was Dr. Reeves in his natural habitat, the legendary cardiac surgeon whose brilliance was matched only by his cruelty. He was a teaching moment incarnate, demonstrating not just surgical technique but the iron hierarchy of the medical world. Emma's hands were shaking as she reached for the correct retractor. She was 26, drowning in student debt from a nursing degree she'd barely completed, working 3 jobs to keep her younger brother in physical therapy after the accident that had taken their parents. The scrub nurse position at Metro General paid $17 an hour, just enough to cover his next round of treatments. The patient on the table between them was already closed, the triple bypass complete. This humiliation was purely recreational. Dr. Reeves pulled off his surgical mask with theatrical flair. "You know what?" he said, his voice now loud enough to reach the gallery. "I'm doing a valve replacement next week. Complex case, very delicate. If you can name all 27 bones in the human hand right now, without hesitation, without error, I'll let you scrub in. I'll even put your name on the operative report." The gallery erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Everyone in that room knew exactly what this was. Emma Cole was a scrub nurse, not a physician. She dealt with instruments in sterile fields, not anatomy lectures. Asking her to recite the carpal, metacarpal, and phalangeal bones in perfect sequence was like asking a parking attendant to rebuild an engine. The phone cameras in the gallery zoomed in. Dr. Reeves was smiling now, that shark smile that had terrorized residents for 30 years. "What's wrong, nurse? Cat got your tongue. It's a simple request, 27 bones, or are you going to admit you're in over your head?" The 3 a.m. alarm had been screaming in Emma's studio apartment for exactly 4 seconds before her hand found it in the dark. The walls were thin enough to hear her neighbor's television through them, the air heavy with the smell of burned coffee from the diner downstairs. This was her world, a 600-square-foot box in a building that should have been condemned a decade ago, 40 minutes by subway from the hospital. Her morning routine was a blur of efficiency learned from years of necessity. By 3:45, she was spooning protein powder into a shaker bottle because actual breakfast cost time she didn't have. By 4:15, she was on the first train, surrounded by the city's invisible workforce, the cleaners and kitchen staff and security guards whose labor powered everything while remaining utterly unseen. The scrub nurse uniform made her disappear. In the hospital corridors, doctors looked through her like she was made of glass. Residents barely acknowledged her presence when demanding instruments. Patients never learned her name. She was a function, not a person, a pair of hands that existed only to serve. But around her neck, hidden under her scrubs, was a small silver pendant her mother had given her the day before the car accident. It wasn't valuable, just a simple medical caduceus on a cheap chain, but inside was a photograph smaller than a postage stamp. Emma at 17, in a white coat at her high school science fair, holding a first-place trophy for her project on cardiac electrophysiology. Her mother had saved everything for Emma's college fund. They were going to do it right, 4 years of pre-med, then medical school, then residency. Emma was going to be a doctor. That was the plan, the promise, the future they'd built together. Then a drunk driver had run a red light, and suddenly Emma was 21 with a 17-year-old brother who needed round-the-clock care and rehabilitation that insurance barely covered. The nursing degree had been pragmatic: faster, cheaper, immediate income. She could work and keep her brother alive, keep him in therapy, keep him moving toward a life that looked something like normal. Medical school became a fantasy she couldn't afford to remember. But her hands remembered. Late at night, after her brother was asleep, she would pull out the anatomy texts she'd bought used in college. She would trace the diagrams, memorize the structures, quiz herself on procedures she would never perform. It was useless knowledge for a scrub nurse, but she couldn't stop. Some part of her refused to let go of what she'd been meant to become. The job at Metro General was supposed to be temporary, just until her brother finished his therapy program. That was 2 years ago. Now it was her entire existence, a prison of financial necessity disguised as employment. Dr. Marcus Reeves stood in the center of the surgical theater lounge, holding court like a king receiving tribute. He wasn't just a cardiac surgeon, he was a brand. His techniques had been featured in the New England Journal of Medicine. His TED Talk on innovative surgical approaches had 6 million views. Hospitals competed to recruit him, offering salary packages that included chauffeurs and private parking spaces. He cultivated his image with the precision he brought to surgery. The cruelty was strategic, part of his mystique. Dr. Reeves didn't suffer fools, didn't tolerate mediocrity, demanded absolute perfection. It made him legendary. Medical students competed brutally for spots on his service, knowing that a recommendation from Marcus Reeves could launch a career. The incident with the scrub nurse was perfect content. It would be on social media within the hour, shared by the medical students in the gallery. "Look at Dr. Reeves," they would say, holding everyone to impossible standards, creating excellence through fire. The narrative would write itself. He'd given a keynote at the International Cardiac Surgery Conference 2 months ago. The hospital's PR team had arranged for a photographer to follow him for a week, documenting his brilliance for a feature in a major medical journal. His office walls were covered with awards, commendations, and photographs of him with celebrities whose hearts he'd repaired. The challenge to the nurse was calculated theater. It reinforced the hierarchy, reminded everyone in the room who held power, and would generate exactly the kind of buzz that kept his mystique alive. Tomorrow, there would be 100 posts about it on medical forums and student social media. Dr. Reeves being Dr. Reeves, impossible to please, demanding the impossible. He was building a legacy, one humiliation at a time. Dr. Sarah Chen, the chief of nursing, watched from the back of the observation gallery. She was 58, had been at Metro General for 33 years, and had seen every type of surgeon the medical system could produce. She knew Marcus Reeves for exactly what he was: a brilliant technician with the emotional intelligence of a brick and the ego of a minor deity. She also knew Emma Cole. Not well, but enough. She'd reviewed Emma's application personally, noticed the gap between her academic credentials and her current position. She'd seen the address in a neighborhood where nurses didn't usually live. She'd approved the hire because something in the application suggested a story that didn't quite fit. Now, watching this public execution, Dr. Chen felt a familiar anger rising. This was why good people left medicine. This was why the system chewed up its most vulnerable and spit them out. Not because they lacked skill, but because some doctor needed to feed his ego. She couldn't intervene directly. Reeves was untouchable, protected by his reputation and his surgical outcomes. But she made a note: "Watch this girl, see what happens." The silence in the operating theater was absolute. 20 medical students in the gallery had their phones aimed at the floor below, capturing every angle. The anesthesiologist had paused his charting. The circulating nurse had frozen mid-step. Even the patient monitors seemed to beep more quietly. Emma Cole stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, the rejected instrument still on the tray beside her. Dr. Reeves was waiting, his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of amusement and absolute certainty. He'd sprung the trap. Now he was waiting for her to struggle in it. This was the moment where she was supposed to stammer an apology, maybe make some excuse about being new, definitely not attempt to actually answer his ridiculous challenge. The smart play was to bow her head, accept the humiliation, keep the job that paid for her brother's therapy. But something was happening behind her eyes. The fear was still there, but it was being joined by something else. A cold calculation, a rapid internal assessment that moved faster than thought. Risk, total public humiliation in front of students who would share the video everywhere, permanent damage to whatever remained of her professional reputation, probable termination, because Reeves would find a way to make her job impossible afterward. Reward, absolutely nothing real, because even if by some miracle she answered correctly, Reeves would find a reason to rescind his offer or make the promised surgery slot a new kind of hell. The math was brutal and clear. She should keep her mouth shut. But she felt the weight of the pendant against her chest. She thought about her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to save for Emma's education. She thought about her brother, who told everyone his sister was going to be a doctor someday because he still believed it even though she'd stopped believing it herself. She thought about the anatomy texts she studied at midnight for no reason except that she couldn't let go. To stay silent now wouldn't just be about avoiding humiliation. It would be an agreement, an acceptance that the uniform defined her, that her circumstances had permanently erased her capabilities, that Dr. Marcus Reeves was correct in his assessment of her worth. Her hands stopped shaking. Her breathing steadied. She looked directly at Dr. Reeves, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and calm. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. She paused for exactly 1 beat. 5 metacarpals numbered 1 through 5 from thumb to pinky finger. 14 phalanges, 3 for each finger, 2 for the thumb. Proximal, middle, and distal for the fingers. Proximal and distal for the thumb. The operating theater stayed silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer anticipatory. It was shocked. Dr. Reeves's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then reasserted itself. "That's the simplified version," he said, his voice slightly less certain. "But fine, you memorized the basics. That doesn't mean you understand them." Emma didn't stop. The scaphoid is the most commonly fractured carpal bone, usually from a fall on an outstretched hand. The lunate can dislocate anteriorly in high-impact trauma. The pisiform is a sesamoid bone within the flexor carpi ulnaris tendon. The trapezium articulates with the first metacarpal at the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb, which has the greatest range of motion of any joint in the hand. The hamate has a hook-like projection called the hamulus that can be fractured in athletes and cause ulnar nerve compression. The medical students in the gallery had stopped recording. They were starring. "The median nerve passes through the carpal tunnel with 9 flexor tendons," Emma continued, her voice gaining strength. "Compression causes carpal tunnel syndrome. The radial nerve innervates the posterior compartment extensors. The ulnar nerve innervates the intrinsic muscles and gives sensation to the medial 1.5 digits. The radial artery runs superficial to the pronator quadratus and can be palpated at the wrist for pulse assessment. The blood supply to the scaphoid is retrograde, which is why proximal pole fractures have high rates of avascular necrosis." Dr. Reeves had gone very still. His arms were no longer crossed. He was staring at this scrub nurse, this nobody in a cheap uniform, as she recited hand anatomy with the fluency of someone who had spent years studying it. "The flexor digitorum superficialis inserts on the middle phalanx," Emma said. "The flexor digitorum profundus inserts on the distal phalanx. The lumbricals flex the metacarpophalangeal joints and extend the interphalangeal joints. The interossae abduct and adduct the fingers. The thenar muscles control thumb opposition. Loss of median nerve function creates an ape hand deformity. Loss of ulnar nerve function creates a claw-hand deformity. She stopped. The operating theater was so quiet you could hear the ventilation system. "That's the hand," Emma said. "Would you like me to continue with the arterial anastomoses, or shall we discuss the biomechanics of grip strength?" Dr. Sarah Chen, watching from the gallery, was smiling for the first time that morning. The video went viral in 6 hours. Not the humiliation Dr. Reeves had orchestrated, but the response he'd never imagined possible. The scrub nurse with perfect anatomical knowledge. The shocking reversal. The public neutering of the legendary Marcus Reeves in his own operating theater. By evening, the video had 3 million views. By midnight, it was on national news. By morning, Emma Cole's life had fundamentally changed. The interview requests started immediately. Good Morning America wanted her for their medical segment. The Washington Post healthcare reporter was waiting outside her apartment building. A literary agent called offering a book deal. A production company wanted to option her story for a limited series. But more importantly, the phone call from Dr. Patricia Morrison, dean of the medical school at Columbia University. "Miss Cole," Dr. Morrison said, "I've reviewed your undergraduate transcripts. You had a perfect science GPA before you left. Your MCAT scores would have qualified you for any medical school in the country. I understand why you stopped. I'm calling to tell you that you don't have to stay stopped." The offer was extraordinary. Full scholarship, stipend for living expenses, a spot in the next entering class which started in 4 months, guaranteed funding for all 4 years. Columbia wanted her, not despite her circumstances, but because her story represented exactly the kind of resilience medicine needed. Emma sat in her tiny apartment, her brother asleep in the other room, and held the phone with both hands. "There's one condition," Dr. Morrison said. "You'll need to maintain your current academic trajectory. This isn't charity. This is an investment in someone who we believe will become an exceptional physician." The consequence cascade for Dr. Marcus Reeves was slower but equally devastating. The video had revealed something the medical community had been willing to ignore, that his legendary cruelty wasn't about maintaining standards, but about feeding his ego. The incident with Emma Cole made him look small, petty, and foolish. Hospital administrators started receiving complaints. Patient advocacy groups questioned why someone with such obvious interpersonal problems was representing their institution. Medical students who had once competed for spots on his service were now requesting transfers. The surgical outcomes were still excellent. His hands were still brilliant, but medicine was changing. The old model of the brutal genius surgeon was dying, replaced by a recognition that technical skill without basic human decency was a liability, not an asset. Marcus Reeves remained employed. He remained prominent, but he was no longer untouchable. The mystique had cracked, and what showed through wasn't impressive. 4 years later, Emma Cole stood in a different operating theater. This one was at Massachusetts General, one of the most prestigious teaching hospitals in the country. She was in her final year of medical school, doing a surgical rotation, and today she was scrubbing in on a complex valve replacement. The attending surgeon was Dr. James Park, a cardiac specialist known for his technical excellence and his kindness. He ran his operating room like a classroom, teaching constantly, encouraging questions, treating every team member with respect. Emma stood across the table from him, her hands steady, her knowledge complete. She had worked harder than she'd ever thought possible. The 4 years at Columbia had been brutal, not because of cruelty, but because of the sheer volume of information that had to be mastered. She had studied while her classmates slept. She had practiced procedures until her hands moved with unconscious precision. Her brother had finished his physical therapy. He was walking again, working as a physical therapist himself now, helping other people recover from the kind of trauma he'd survived. He called her twice a week to tell her how proud their parents would have been. The surgery was delicate, replacing a calcified mitral valve in a 68-year-old man whose heart was barely functioning. Dr. Park worked methodically, his movements economical and precise, narrating every step for the benefit of the medical students in the gallery. "Dr. Cole," he said, "why don't you close the pericardium?" She took the needle driver he offered, positioned the suture, and began working. Her hands moved with confidence, placing stitches that were exactly the right tension, exactly the right spacing. This was what she had been meant to do, not because she was brilliant, but because she had refused to accept that circumstances could permanently define capability. When the surgery was finished, Dr. Park pulled off his surgical mask and smiled at her. "Beautiful work," he said. "You're going to be an excellent surgeon." The gallery above applauded. 3 months later, Emma received her acceptance to the surgical residency program at Johns Hopkins. 5 years of training under some of the best cardiac surgeons in the world. The letter came on the same day as her medical school graduation. She stood in her apartment, the letter in her hand, looking at the pendant her mother had given her 13 years ago. The photograph inside was faded now, barely visible, but she didn't need to see it. She knew exactly what it showed. Dr. Marcus Reeves sent a message through a mutual colleague. "Congratulations on the residency match," it said. "Perhaps we can discuss collaboration opportunities when your training is complete." Emma read the message once, then deleted it without responding. Some bridges weren't worth rebuilding. Some people weren't owed the satisfaction of your acknowledgement. She had one final task before graduation. Dr. Sarah Chen had invited her to speak at a nursing conference about non-traditional paths to medicine. Emma stood at the podium looking out at 300 nurses, many of whom were working multiple jobs, many of whom had dreams they'd been told to abandon. "I'm not here to tell you that everything works out," she said. "I'm here to tell you that circumstances are not the same as capability. The system will try to convince you that your position defines your potential. It will try to make you invisible. It will reward cruelty and mistake arrogance for excellence." She paused, her hands resting on the podium. "But here's what I learned. The person mopping the floor might be memorizing organic chemistry. The person adjusting your IV might understand pharmacology better than the resident who ordered it. The person society has decided is invisible might be extraordinary. And if you're that person, if you're carrying something larger than your current circumstances, don't let anyone convince you that the uniform is your ceiling." The applause was long and sustained. That evening, Emma walked across the stage to receive her medical degree. Her brother was in the audience, standing and cheering louder than anyone else. Dr. Sarah Chen was there too, sitting with the nursing school faculty, her face proud. Dr. Marcus Reeves was not invited. Emma's white coat, the one she'd received in the ceremony earlier that week, hung in her apartment. In the pocket was a small notebook where she kept a list of things to remember. At the top of the first page, written in her mother's handwriting from a letter sent years ago, were 4 words. "They were wrong about you." Below it, in Emma's own hand, she had added one more line. "They were wrong about themselves too." 5 years of surgical residency stretched ahead of her. Long hours, impossible pressure, moments of doubt and exhaustion. But she would complete them. She would become the cardiac surgeon she had been meant to be. Not because of one moment in an operating theater, but because she had refused to believe that where you start determines where you finish. The story doesn't end with triumph, but with work. With the quiet determination of someone who understands that the real victory isn't the moment of vindication, but the years of steady progress that follow it. Emma Cole closed her notebook, packed her bag, and prepared for the next phase. The path forward was long and difficult and absolutely certain. She had always known where she was going. Now, finally, nothing stood in her way.